Okay, welcome everyone. Today is January 16th, 2019. Today we have a guest speaker, and this is our EBC Thought Leaders webinar series. Today, Dr. Mike Alexander Abravanel, you can let me know if I have that correct.
Abravanel, yeah.
Abravanel. He will be talking about his dissertation research on the blossoming of coaching presence. And we have a slide to share just to, so everyone kind of sees what this is all about. And really proud to have Mike joining us today. He's from Concordia University and is one of our guest lecturers on this program to share his dissertation and all of what he learned that applies to the field of coaching. So Mike, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump into what you discovered in your research.
Sure, wonderful. And actually, if we're using the slides, can we go to the third slide then? I'll say a little bit about myself from there.
Perfect.
My background into coaching and doing my PhD dissertation on coaching presence actually started with an undergrad in Eastern religion at Concordia as well, and Eastern philosophy. So really approached mindfulness. And then it was during my master's at Concordia University that I got introduced to coaching, and specifically then decided to integrate both of them, meaning the Eastern, the contemplative side, and explore coaching presence as one of the core coaching competencies. And just to share about my lens, so I just finished my PhD dissertation this fall. So it's very recent. And it was an 8-year journey. And during that process, I also have been a coach practitioner. So coaching presence has been something that has been applied in my coaching practice as a recovery coach at an addiction center where I've been working the last 5 years, in private practice, and of course, as a researcher. So it's all come together, and really an opportunity for me to combine my interest in Eastern philosophy and presence specifically, and then really anchored within the field, the context of coaching.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mike. So I'm just really curious, what drew you to this particular topic? How did you decide to study this as part of your PhD studies?
It was actually in conversation with my PhD supervisor at Concordia, Dr. Jim Gavin, who's done a lot of research on embodiment. He's a black belt in Aikido. And then myself, from more the mindfulness, the practice-oriented perspective, I was just really curious as to what, talking about a way of being. And it was a bit nebulous. I think the challenge was, can I do research on something that is very hard to make concrete? But I was really excited about exploring the bridge really between this Eastern contemplative approach and then really anchored within the coaching field. It was a combination, a juxtaposition of both. And then I felt fortunate that that type of research was permitted.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Fielding certainly as well certainly looks at its cross and transdisciplinary approach. So it's very much in line with much of the research some of our own students at Fielding often engage in. So I'd love to hear what were some of your key findings, as well as your core research question that you went about looking at.
Okay, well then might as well use some of the slide here, and
absolutely.
So yeah, if we go to coaching presence, yes. Let me just say from this, the context that led me to this research, and Terry, you and I had a brief conversation how there's much more emphasis over here on the practitioner side. There's a lot on core coaching competencies. There's a lot about coaching presence from coaching organizations, but actual scholarly research on coaching presence is very few and far between. And there is some research, but the key thing is some even studies talk about coaching presence, but I make a key distinction here about coaching presence as referring specifically to the presence of the coach and during a coaching session versus presence in coaching, which more can broadly include the client presence as well. So on the client presence, there's much more written, but specifically on coaching presence, it's hard to find research, evidence-based research. And so I did, the starting point was the basic coaching presence definition as the ability to be fully conscious and create spontaneous relationship with the coaching client, employing a style that is open, flexible, and confident. But what was a little bit different about the research that I did is I didn't want it to be totally mindfulness oriented. So if you go to the next slide on the literature review, presence in coaching, this literature review and the focus and the lens of my study was very much interdisciplinary. And a lot of researchers, I think of Cox, I think of Olivia Wood, talk about presence in coaching as a multi-dimensional concept. So I really wanted to appreciate that. So whether it's mindfulness or flow or some of the embodiment awareness literature. And so that was very important for me. If we go to the next slide, the purpose and significance. So focuses specifically on coaching presence on the side of the coach, and that looks at coaching presence as a multi-dimensional view of presence, as opposed to focusing mindfulness in coaching, and really grounded in the perspective of the coach. So for my purpose, it was only looking at presence in coaching from the coach's perspective. And so I did have the opportunity to interview 16 ICF certified coaches, and the intention was to create a grounded theory approach or understanding of coaching presence. Yeah.
Great. And these were your research questions, it sounds like. And if you could say just a little bit about these questions and how you got here.
Right. So in terms of the research questions, I wanted to know how to contribute. And so how is coaching presence understood by experienced coaching practitioners? So here was looking at coaches in the field. And one thing very important for me is to have a look of a grounded examination of it. So rather than getting just a meta definition, like what does coaching presence look like? And this relates to question number 2, during the coaching session itself. Like that's the context, the container. Mm-hmm. And not only what it looks like, but what is the experience of being present and not being present during a coaching session. So those were both elements. So in asking questions, the aim wasn't just to be theoretical, though it was, is also then to ask for concrete stories, experiences, or what's called exemplars of situations where coaches, ideally in recent experiences in the last 2 weeks, had an experience of high coaching presence where they experienced that, and low coaching presence to be able to contrast that. So it was really focused and really guided, and part of the reason is because of the multidimensionality of the concept and to really be focused. That was the intention.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So I think this is really a fascinating research question. Like you mentioned before, there's a coaching presence is taught in probably every coaching school that ICF certifies because it's one of the core 11 competencies, and the PCC markers are certainly part of coaching presence is what we're looking for. And however, you've taken a step deeper, which we're certainly interested here in at Fielding and in our evidence-based coaching school and in our PhD programs to really dig deeper and get at the core of this. And so I'm very excited about this research that you're beginning to really create a foundation that builds upon maybe good practice to understand really what happens in a coaching session and what shows up here. So,
right.
So I'm very excited to hear about your findings.
Okay, we can go over there if you'd like.
All right, great.
Right, so my findings from this, so being very specific, once again, this is about coaching presence during the coaching session. And so there were 6 themes that emerged. And the very first one is what people most think about in terms of coaching presence. Often the emphasis, on mindfulness. So mindful self-awareness. Mm-hmm. The coach being mindful and self-aware in the role of coach while accessing inner spaciousness and knowing. There's supportive findings to that. Of course, those are all elaborated in my thesis itself. But what I will say is that mindful self-awareness has to do about the coach, him or herself, how they show up. And it's very difficult to see externally, but it was my inner process, how I'm mindfully self-aware, or conversely, the times where I am disengaged from myself. So that was one of the themes that was very strong. And secondly, authentic connection. The coach offering empathetic connection to the client in an authentic, intuitive, and interconnected way. So this really connects to the fact that coaching presence is part of co-creating the relationship in terms of the 11 core coaching competencies. And in this authentic connection, the coach said it's in this we space, in this interconnected, empathetic space where it's authentic, it's intuitive, there's a sense of responsiveness. Mm-hmm. There's a shared space. I mean, some people, went and used more evocative or spiritual language, such as, we felt connected, or there was a spiritual connection. Others described it more intuitively or interconnected. So that's really together. This is coach and client. Deep attunement is more the coach attuning to the client. Mm-hmm. So it's more one-dimensional. So a lot of the coaches shared how essential, though, it was to be able to be in a space of deeply attuning to the client and consciously communicating in a deep way. And what I mean by that is that in deep attunement, the coach was able to attune to the language of the client. Be able to be attentive to their way of constructing reality, and then consciously communicating and languaging that to a way that lands with the client. Mm-hmm. And that was very essential. And for all these supportive findings in the dissertation itself, I elaborate on ways when that doesn't happen, when the coach misses language and is not imposing more of their way of seeing or being. Embodied engagement was the coach's element of embodied engagement, because I was always looking here at the coach's side of presence. There has been research, and this was one area that I didn't go into, is the client's presence, but embodied engagement, the coach fully engaged while somatically grounded to the here and now. So this became really important about how do I show up, how do I present myself with my body. Somatic presence is the term often used in the literature. And it came up. But some people have this view as presence as almost like you're sitting mindfully on a cushion. And a number of the more experienced coaches said somatic presence in a relationship during the coaching session is not that. It's having, yes, a firm spine and a soft belly, but being able to adapt and move. And how do I use space? Can I give space? Can I lean forward when I need to? And it is this element of, and I'm quite expressive in my body language sometimes, and of course the context matters. But am I embodied and appropriate to the here and now, and fluidly responding to the client? So this is one thing that the coach does. Mm-hmm. Holding outcomes. Theme 5 and 6 are 2 of the themes that are least talked about in the coaching literature, or not at all, in truth, or very minutely, and especially not in the therapeutic literature to the degree that it came up in my findings, because we're talking about coaching presence compared to therapeutic presence. So one, holding outcomes. The coach holding a robust container during the coaching session while intentionally allowing for emergent outcomes based on the coach's agenda. Emergent outcomes based on should be the client's agenda. But in this case of the holding outcomes, the coach has to be aware, has to be present to also what is the intention of the coaching session?
Right.
Because coaching has a strong action orientation, the degree that's not found perhaps in some other helping professions, that being present to what is the client here for becomes a very important dimension of coaching presence that a number of coaches talked about. And yes, being able to do that in an emergent way, but as a coach, how can I hold the container for what is the topic? What is the agenda of the client? And how can I always bring that back into the session and making sure that that container is held in an open and spacious way?
Mm-hmm.
And then also similarly, structural alignment is discussed much less in some of the other, for example, therapeutic presence literature, but the coach providing alignment to the field of the coaching session while skillfully employing communication tools. A lot of coaches that I interviewed discussed, well, the majority of my coaching sessions happen over phone via some sort of mediated communication. And there was one individual who I interviewed that did his dissertation on social presence in coaching and using mediated communication, and to be very aware of how we use technology.
Right.
And so if, I can imagine the background right now as I'm speaking, is it appropriate for this conversation? Am I able to make eye contact if I'm using video? Is there an alignment? So that's the skillful use of mediated communication. Coaches didn't say this way is the best, though each coach perhaps had their preferred, most of them being one-on-one in person. But the reality is most people also did a mix of different forms of coaching over via Skype or any other forms. And then also in person, though, the environmental alignment becomes very important, the structure and the space. So, for example, a lot of coaches talk about a collaborative relationship. Well, if there's a big desk in between the coach and client, perhaps that could be a barrier. If there's too much noise or distraction, I mean, some extreme examples are, for example, having a coaching session at a cafe where there's other noise, there's issues of confidentiality. And so I found that this is a lot of information, obviously. And before I share, I want to how I conceptualize it. Do you have any comments, Terry? Anything?
Yeah. So I think a lot of these feel aligned with PCC markers. And I'm also curious about what are some of the things you noticed, because part of your research question was, what goes wrong potentially, or when does coaching presence not show up? I'm just kind of wondering, what are some of the challenges that people mentioned in either, some or all of these different themes you found in your study?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Yeah, what are some of the challenges? And people did share about it. And first, on that note, I would say that a lot of the coaches said that it was an ongoing intention to be present, and that perhaps there isn't this perfect, I am completely present, but an intention to be present. So, for example, mindful self-awareness. And it could happen that a coach is having in the coaching session and they get disengaged from the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Maybe like getting bored with what the client's saying, perhaps.
Precisely, getting bored, and that makes them think about something else and their mind's drifting.
Right.
So a skillful way to deal with that is to say, okay, that does happen, like in meditation, but can I realign myself to this role and bring myself back, even if that's again and again? Or a lot of coaches come in with, for example, consulting backgrounds,
right,
or even therapeutic, and they find themselves moving into a different modality. And so sometimes awareness, I went into a consulting role. Here, I'm going to come back to a coaching role. So those were some of the elements for the first theme. In terms of authentic connection, often some people described when there's inauthenticity, that can get in the way of connection, and create more fabricated responses. that provides a barrier to really getting to know people. And the client can feel it, was what some of the coaches said. When the coach is not being really true to who they are or what they're about, the client feels a disconnection sometimes, and that can really impact the session.
So I'm just curious about that. What do you think might lead to that lack of authenticity? I'm just curious if anyone shared any examples where the coach maybe wasn't being truly authentic.
I think a number of people described having the most difficulty as a beginner in coaching and going through their certification and practicing. So part of the authenticity is not feeling fully comfortable yet in the coaching role and not knowing when to share, when not to share, and so potentially oversharing, undersharing, and so, for example, at a high level, it would be like, you know what, excuse me, I got distracted for a moment. I want to be present to you. Whereas inauthenticity could be, oh yeah, no, I'm right with you. Not wanting to show those moments as a coach where we are human, where we do make mistakes, where we lose attention for a moment, and having challenges with really being clear about that. Or, when something that the client says, it's like, ooh, at the more skilled level is like, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. Whereas the beginner coach could say, well, yeah, no, I got it. I got this.
Wow.
So especially in the authentic connection in the relationship, was not really attuning to some of those cues in a way that's quite meaningful.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm also curious about attunement. This whole idea of consciously communicating in a deep way. What do you think that could look like based on your studies and examples? I guess would love to see and what that looks and feels like as an example.
So one coach who does a lot of coach training, he's a master certified coach, described the importance of language. And he said that in my interview with him, that when we have a language or when the client uses a word, that rings down to a part of themselves. And so at the more or less skilled level, we could try and ask all these questions or put all our overlays and frames. And he said, if you're really tuning into the client, if you're really listening to them, you may zoom into something strikes you in that one word, and then you say, tell me more about this. And the conversation drops. But you really need to listen to it, because a coach could, in 3 minutes, especially if they're more verbose, there's a lot of language, there's a lot of information. And this is the attuning. Another image or metaphor was like a web. And so there's like this net, this web, and a lot that the client says goes past you, but part of the coach is like developing our antennas, and something sticks onto the web, and using our intuition, okay, I need to ask about this. But really that only comes if we're deeply attuned to the client and to what's going on inside of them.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is listening for those keywords that really capture you at a deeper level, like in your gut. You're like, oh, that's important. That was a keyword. And then, I know Judith E. Glaser used to call that double clicking, right? I'm gonna double click on that word.
Exactly.
Explore it a little deeper. Excellent.
Right.
Anything else here that you'd like to share a little more deeply about? The somatic part, for example, I know Dr. Deepa Awal was on your committee, is that right?
Yes,
she's one of our fielding EBC certificate faculty, and she's an expert in somatic. So I'd like to hear more about that. What did you discover around this whole idea of embodiment in the somatic research?
So, some of what came out around that is, first of all, there's some schools of training that really do put a lot of emphasis. So I interviewed a lot of people from Integral Coaching Canada, or some people from Strozzi Institute, where there's this element that the coach is attuned to practically their breath at one level, their breathing, and sometimes that can impact a conversation too. If they notice themselves getting anxious or tightened, the coach, or even the client, by slowing down their breathing, they can actually have an impact on the conversation. That was one very concrete way. So also some coaches, not only did they want to show up in a somatically engaged way, they would actually, if they found there was tension or the client was confused, they'd actually slow down and say, hey, can we take a moment to have a couple deep breaths together? So they would invite the client into that space as well. Mm-hmm. And then the body, some of the things of like not to do, you know, the body language or the barriers between people. And what I found fascinating from the somatic side was seeing presence as a fluid element, and meaning that it was also about space. Like if I'm, as a coach, taking space, I'm leaning in, or I'm offering space by leaning back. And how, as a coach, to be present, there's not just one way of being present. Like sometimes it's helpful to be really engaged in the conversation, and sometimes a little bit more distant. And so Olivia Wood, in her book, describes coaching presence in stages and says, well, we can actually, as a coach, choose to show up more or less. And sometimes that's appropriate depending on the context. If I'm just getting to know a client, well, my totally being there may not be appropriate because I want to be able to allow the client to show up. And so how can I minimize myself? But in some individuals with very business-oriented clientele, they expressed the importance that they were perhaps a little bit more directive in their body language and a little bit more confrontative for that context. Yeah. So that was interesting to hear the contextual dimensions.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, thank you for that. You know, one of the things you said just now about embodiment, I know on occasion when I'm dealing with clients who are going through a very intense emotional experience, I'll find myself breathing through it. Mm-hmm. And even asking them on occasion to take a deep breath, to just let that process and flow in and out of their body. So that's something that came up for me. I'm just kind of curious if emotions were tied to this in any significant way with your study participants.
Yes, I found that more tied. And first of all, thank you for sharing that, Terry. So what you're doing is exactly what experienced coach discussed as ways to be embodied in themselves and then with the client. Breathing, when you just shared. The place where I found emotions to come in was more related to mindful self-awareness and holistic self-awareness, which include our cognitive biases and our emotional states. So that's the place precisely. And that became very important because even, for example, one coach shared that she had a bias where she didn't like to be complimented during a coaching session as a coach. And so she found herself getting tense or anxious anytime a client said, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And so it sounds like a small bias, but she was just saying, like, around that, like, she had to have that awareness of herself and how her uncomfortability and anxiety around that impeded the coaching session.
Right.
Or someone else who was very attracted to shiny objects and like a curiosity, and how sometimes her excitement, even which is a positive emotion, could distract her and the client from really what's important in the session. So I found some of those little stories interesting.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Number 5, around holding outcomes. A lot of this sounds like the core competency number 1 around, you know, having a coaching agreement, you know, at the beginning, and then holding that space with that agreement for the client throughout the whole session.
Absolutely.
I was wondering, how do you see 5 tied to you know, the competency number? Actually, it's number 2 technically. 1 is on ethics, but number 2 on holding the coaching agreement.
Absolutely. And what you're asking to me is a relevant question, because coaching presence, and in my findings, it did include elements, for example, like the coaching agreement and the agenda. The distinction here was more the way that one does it. And so, for example, holding outcomes, the supportive findings, like holding the outcomes in an emergent way, as opposed to having a very directive agenda. And so how can I hold the space in a way that my I'm both intentional and adaptive to what's coming up in the coaching session. And so there's some overlap certainly with having a coaching agreement, et cetera, but very different from some sort of kind of linear focus. This is what we're going to focus on. We're going to get our results. We're going to get our solution. No, how can I, once again, even hold this in a way? And that's why it became a little bit nebulous describing coaching presence, because certainly as I was involved in this research, is that a lot of the findings when we talk about communication, when we talk about agenda, there's things that are found in other competencies.
Mm-hmm.
But the distinctions seem to be quite subtle, actually, and it's the way we do it. And Carl Rogers in the therapeutic literature said, you know, there's some unspecified thing that's very important for therapy, and of course, different contexts, but he described this presence, this numinous presence as a way of showing up. And I think that's why it's been hard to study this, potentially.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say on coaching outcomes is it is about the agreement, but I think the key word I see here on the right is emergent outcomes and this adaptable approach that's both intentional and adaptable. So it's not like being rigid about the agreement, but seeing what might show up and how that might evolve and what other things might emerge during the conversation. Do I have that right, or would you?
That's right on, Terry. Yeah, exactly. It becomes how versus some ways of the lower levels of coaching presence would be very rigid, very structured, in a way that constrains this adaptive, emergent quality. Because presence, even the ICF definition, talks about dancing in the moment as an element of coaching presence. And so that includes not only the relationship, but building the agenda.
Right.
So I heard coaches talk about it in terms of the agenda itself and not just the relationship.
Absolutely. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So just a couple more thoughts around structural alignment. You mentioned using technology and how that shows up. What were some of the best practices that you heard around technology? Because I know this is often a question, how effective is, video and phone coaching versus in person? And there's certainly some people have a bias toward only doing in person, and others may do all of their work via phone. And many people are afraid to use video because of how they might look, or being self-conscious about watching themselves on video. My personal thing is I probably do 90% of my coaching via video nowadays.
Right.
But were there any suggestions or best practices around this number 6 that we might be able to take away?
Sure. And just to say, many coaches shared your experience, Terry, where whatever their preference was, pragmatically, they're doing the majority of their coaching sessions via some sort of mediated communication. So I'll share a couple of best practices for each. And one, so via phone, let's say phone, video, and in person. So via phone, one person said that, you can really need to listen to the energetic signals being communicated. And that was fascinating because he said for him, video distracted him personally, his preference, but this capacity then to listen into very deep ways. And I know that sounds kind of vague in some ways, but in some ways to do that, people would avoid any distractions or maybe close their eyes if you're just using phone, so that all the intention and attention is directed towards the words, the language, and the feelings under that via the client, rather than being distracted by your own environment. And I mean, this is more beginner level, but people doing other things, multitasking, or having some things in their visual cue or awareness that can distract them from the session. In terms of Skype, video, etc., it became very important, lines of communication and the way that the screen is situated, so that you can have a clear line of sight, and someone who did his dissertation on mediated communication spoke about the line of sight, spoke about not having too much background stuff going on, that there's containment, no noise, and that can include even a phone going off. I mean, some of these things are common sense, but I find it's good to just have them articulated. In person, the environment, being present, for some included, well, if I'm giving my client homework, well, in that space, I'm going to have that homework present in a way that's readily accessible, and create an environment where there is no distraction, where where we can be focused, and that includes the spacing of the chairs, the setup. So a lot of coaches discussed preparing their environment for 5 to 10 minutes before a client comes in. And I think that's definitely pressing when someone's in there. And that becomes the environmental alignment, especially people doing kind of coaching, executive coaching, working in with a business and potentially coaching many employees. Do they have a space that's private? Do they have not some sort of open space kind of area? And if so, how do they deal with some of those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I've run into that myself when I go to a client site and we have to do the session in the cafeteria, because they, a lot of the Bay Area companies now have this open concept, right? And there are no offices, and there's even no walls in many cases. So privacy is kind of a thing of the past in some open office layouts. So it becomes a real challenge. I even have people sometimes coaching me or meeting with me in their cars, right? So I think this is a real challenge nowadays around, how do you create a space that, as you call it, structurally aligned, that is conducive to really being present.
And what you're saying to me is also not to be rigid at all. Also, what are the realities that we're dealing with? And I could say, and these are sometimes ideals, this is the way the environment, but I've had a coaching session in a park before. And this is what the client preferred. And this is where, I get into my blossoming lotus of coaching presence, where I put it all together. And yes, and so to me, the structural alignment is really the stem that holds up coaching presence. So to me, coaching presence shows up, all these themes show up together, and the structural alignment holds up the coaching presence. So it's very difficult to be present, like when someone shared, when I went to a client's house and her kids were running around and there was noise, and she walked around out of that coaching session, the coach did, with a nosebleed. You can be a master coach, but if the structure is that in disaccord, it's very difficult.
Right. Yeah. It becomes a challenge.
A real challenge. And I found mindful self-awareness and embodied engagement of this lotus, the lotus of coaching presence. And I realized I didn't give a back story. So just to back up for a moment. So the lotus actually does grow, literally, out of the mud. And as the sun rises, the lotus comes out of the mud and has a protective sheath biologically, and it opens up with the rising of the sun. And I found this very appropriate for coaching presence, because coaching presence blossoms during the coaching relationship in interaction with the client. So the structural alignment provides the stem. And then the internal elements, mindful self-awareness and embodied engagements, I saw as lower petals. And lower petals, not because they're less important, but because they're more internal focus. My client cannot see my mindful self-awareness. Maybe they can guess at it, but if I'm thinking about, I'm in Canada right now, so I'm thinking about, it would be so nice to go to the beach in California. They're not going to see that. But it's inside me, and it does have an impact. Or my embodied engagement, my physicality, how am I showing up in that coaching conversation? So these are the internal elements. I see them as happening all at once. And this is the way my coaches, the coaches describe their experience. It wasn't sequential. It wasn't like A, B, C, D. This is all happening at once. There's deep attunement, holding outcomes, which is now the coach really tuning into the client, attuning, and then holding the agenda, holding the session. Almost unanimously, coaches describe authentic connection, that we space, that shared space, as the very heart of coaching presence, which really makes sense as it is described as a relational competency. And it's that experience or that feeling of being connected together. Having said that, what I found is that it's a holistic blossoming of coaching presence, that this flower opens and so all of those ingredients are part of it and interrelated. That's how I really saw it.
Excellent. So given all this and what you've found, I'd love to move this a little bit into how you've been able to improve or develop your own coaching presence with your clients. And along with that, any recommendations you might have for our listeners who would like to do the same.
Okay. So I didn't include it here, but all the coaches I interviewed, I asked them the question, how do you cultivate coaching presence outside of a coaching session? Like preparation for coaching presence. So yes, all of this occurs during the coaching session itself. But for example, ways that I have cultivated is I did 3 years of martial arts, of Aikido. I've done some yoga, which is some things that many of the coaches shared. Now, in terms of the environment, the space, I am someone that is not so attuned naturally to the environment, in truth. It's just not my orienting point. And so when I am working one-on-one in coaching or doing even group team coaching, even though the focus of my research was one-on-one, is I'm much more conscientious of the space itself. What is the distance between me and my client? Mm-hmm. Are there distractions in the external environment? And in ways, what I think is important about this and what I would see pragmatically taking this and applying it to coaching is a personal self-inventory. So we have ICF as a core coaching competency. Well, out of these 6 dimensions of coaching presence, there are certain elements that I'm lower on. I have that awareness of it. So this helped me realize that mindful self-awareness, I've been doing meditation, I've been doing mindfulness practice for years. So that's a strong point. But the authentic connection and truly attuning to the client in their own language, in their own emotional space, I needed to become very more skilled in that way. And so I did a training on emotion-based psychotherapy, actually, that I can bring into my coaching because I knew that was a weak spot. Or something else I find in terms of the holding the outcomes for the client, it reaffirmed how important for me, no matter where the coaching conversation is, that part of being present in my role of coach includes an outcome. So I do a lot of recovery coaching, which is related to the field of addiction. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, if I'm present, aware, attuned to the client and notice whether they're feeling, but can I always hold the conversation? Is this helpful for them in their recovery? Because I think when I was starting off with coaching presence, I was either too much focused on myself. Okay, I got to be mindful. I got to be aware. But in doing that, it's an actual barrier to presence. Mm-hmm. Or overly tuning into the connection, which without thinking about the wider space. Right. So more concretely, a number of the coaches interviewed said that they needed to be consciously aware of their role of coach and ongoing development and training in what is being present as a coach versus being present as a consultant, being present as a therapist. And I think that's especially important for people that have done other forms of, or I have a ton of other experience. And then I think also the body-oriented practices, and something that I found very important was the heart-oriented practices, relationally oriented. And so some shared, well, my family is a wonderful training ground for that. And we had the holidays recently, but can I keep my heart and being open in everyday relationships? Some people emphasize, well, if I want to develop authentic connection, perhaps it's not enough just mindfulness. Maybe there are other dimensions that are more devotional, or even prayer, or heart-based connection that becomes important, emotional literacy. And yeah, so what I found is that not only can you cultivate presence outside of coaching session, also many experienced coaches took 5 to 10 minutes before the coaching session to calm down, to get centered. They did practices to make sure that they had what they needed there, to make sure that the space is prepared, and almost like an internal, external checklist. So to me, in ideally, one is preparing and cultivating presence outside of the coaching session through ongoing practices, and then takes 5 to 10 minutes before the coaching session. And then in the moment, let's go, and is able to show up during the coaching session. Right. That is the ideal.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all the best practices. A lot of great tips there. That, a lot of what you described almost felt like and focusing on the internal, almost this self-awareness and mindfulness being about focusing inward and really attending to what's going on in one's own mind and body and spirit, and then moving outward to focus on the interpersonal. So I see kind of that interplay showing up here between the intrapersonal and then the interpersonal, and even the larger system that you were talking about regarding the what's happening in the environment. So I'm also wondering, I know this was in the context of one-on-one coaching, but what do you think might be some of the implications for group or team coaching?
What I noticed, because actually for the past 5 years, I do a lot of group coaching as well in recovery. And I would say that it's very similar. And if anything, though, you outlined them very well, intrapersonal, interpersonal, and then the systemic or environmental. The systemic or the environment becomes that much more important. What are the group dynamics, for example, occurring? And so I think as a coach, I think the complexity increases, I would have to say. And I'm trying to connect with concretely, what would that mean, or how does that change things for me? I think what it does is it really puts me in a place where I do need to be transparent during this coaching session with more complexity. And sometimes I may even take a moment like, okay, let me reflect on my question. And I think slowing things down, that's what I come down to. Also, especially, perhaps it's the environment I work with. A lot of people are frenetic. And so now what I'll do is not only focus on my coaching presence, is that I'll try and influence the presence of the people that I'm working with. And like what you said about breathing, I'll do that. And I have the luxury to do that in a group context. I might even do a mindfulness meditation. I may even, and also that ongoing awareness of my biases becomes really important in a group context where the group can go in so many directions. But the biggest advantage in a group is the emergent outcomes. I find there's much more possibility in group coaching.
Okay, excellent.
Those are some of, yeah.
So I know we have some audience members here today, and I just want to make sure we answer any questions that they might have. So I want to open it up to our participants. Anyone online that would like to ask a question, you can go ahead and turn on your audio and feel free to ask that.
Okay, this is Susan. Mike, thanks so much for sharing. And Terry, your skillful questions, great role modeling. Yeah, I do have a question. How much of this process or these learnings do you share with your clients?
Mm-hmm.
You know, either in the group setting or one-on-one?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. In truth, almost none. And it's been this interesting thing. So as a researcher, took 8 years to complete my dissertation. I was totally immersed in it. And I would have thought that I would sometimes even open that I'm doing my PhD in coaching and this and that. I can count on my hands the amount of times that some client has explicitly said, I want to develop presence. And so what I found that I have done is, in some ways, it's just to model it. And it's something, it's not going to be, or from my own experience, it's rarely been, and for coach training, it's different, but I'm talking about like with actual clients, that it's never been like, oh yeah, my coaching topic is I want to develop my presence. No, it's really in conjunction with other things. But I have found by modeling it, I often get comments or feedbacks like, wow, there's something calm about you, or you really zoom in on the question. And so I've resisted almost completely to talk about presence, and that it's been more an indirect fruit.
Okay. And so does that, has your work influenced how you meet a person, you know, for the first time, and how you talk about what coaching is and, you know, creating that agreement?
Okay. Essentially, it's 100% influenced the way I show up during the coaching session. And so, for example, I'll often create agreement around a coaching topic that allows space for emergence and that is big enough that I can allow my attunement and my presence to be aware of different dimensions. I do recovery coaching, which is strong personal professional relationship. There's space for that.
Uh-huh.
I think it may depend in those who work more with executive clients. Those more personal dimensions may have to be more explicitly agreed upon. But in my work, I guess because of the nature of my clientele, I've had that initial spaciousness, I believe. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I just happen to be thinking about this because I've got a call with a potential client,
mm-hmm.
and it would be with the executive for an employee. So
mm-hmm.
I just was wondering, in terms of, you know, now that you've been talking about this, I'm wondering what might be an appropriate way to talk about this, if at all, in
mm-hmm.
explaining about an approach, you know, in terms of trying to establish a relationship. So it's not actually a coaching session. It's really talking about what happens in coaching.
I mean, I think everybody has a different approach. I mean, from what I'm hearing, and the executives, and I do work with some entrepreneurs and executives. So I think as much as I've worked on my own coaching presence with executives, often what I find myself doing is saying, okay, first of all, I offer a developmental approach. So it's rare that I'll have just one coaching session.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it allows or affords the opportunity for me to like slow down the conversation, or executives that are, you know, have to make decisions so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about this. Like, go into the insight, like go into the connecting between the space that we are. Like, can we make space for conversations and inquiry? So maybe in some ways I do a lot of things that make use of presence without ever calling it such, like more just done in the moment during the coaching session. And a number of entrepreneurs, executives have really appreciated, they tell me that I've been able to see things differently. And that's some of the fruit of attuning to a client in a deeper way. Executives, like, they can see their issue and their problem in different ways. And then it slows it down the conversation to try and get to some of the deeper or more essential dimensions.
Okay.
that's the way I've approached it, Susan.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
Thank
Bill,
you.
thank you, Susan, for asking those questions. And something came up as you asked that question around, does this have implications for executive presence? You know, we've talked about what makes for great coaching, and you've studied the coach's side. There's a huge interest in executive presence. And
Yes.
any thoughts on that? You know, I know this is speculative perhaps, but any thoughts on how this might transfer to research on executive presence?
Okay, so before that, I just have a thought around coaches that as they're coaching presence with executives, they've talked about their presence being more fierce. Because if they were just more spacious, or what's associated with a lot of mindfulness, that in order as a coach working with executives, that their presence is more taking space, more directive, more confrontative. So I would say fierce. And that in the executive context, that's more encouraged. And then precisely executives, executive presence, like you're suggesting, value some of what is considered more fierce or more taking up space or showing up as their whole self versus other forms of presence.
Interesting. Fascinating. So anyone else on the line would like to ask a question?
Yeah, Terry, thanks. I would. And thanks, Mike. I just really want to appreciate your dissertation and topic, and the joining of both the grounded theory approach with this very emergent piece, and the way in which I think there's a lot in coaching that is emergent, and to pick something up like that and bring that as a focus, I think is a wonderful thing. The many questions I have, but one of the things I'm just interested in is whether you plan to take this forward and how you might be focusing on that in the future, if you're planning to extend your research or make use of it in any way.
So the dissertation is published, and Terry has that now, so that may be available to fielding. And first and foremost, I must just say, just one, really appreciate being here in the conversation, and also to hear Fielding University, all that you are doing, because as you can see, well, thank you, Terry, it's up there. I did my PhD at Concordia University in an individualized program, and I had the wonderful support of my supervisor, but I did not have a community around me. I was like the lone wolf. And so that made it, there was challenges associated with that. So I just recently finished the PhD, so I would like to publish, and I'm open to where that is, but I haven't done it yet. I needed some space in the fall from the PhD, and I'm only now in a place of like, okay, my supervisor was instrumental in this. We're discussing publishing it, and definitely want to make it available, because even though my PhD dissertation is on the short side, it's 100 pages-ish, you know, without all the additional stuff, to make it shorter, more accessible. And my interest is in the scholar practitioner. And so I really am very interested in how does this make sense for practitioners. I would have liked to take my research more on a practitioner side, but my committee wanted me to focus more on understanding versus the concrete cultivation dimensions of presence. So that really interests me in terms of further inquiry. Well, how do I cultivate these dimensions of presence? And to publish definitely in a shorter form, Though personally, my interest is working more with scholar practitioners and practitioners. I'm a practicing coach myself, and that's where I'm mostly interested. So that's why fielding a community around like that, it's great to have that, because it's not everywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we really appreciate you joining us today, and this is obviously part of our larger goal of creating a community of practice that includes not only fielding folks, but the larger coaching community of scholar practitioners. So we're really thrilled to have you today, and you know, all of what you've shared, and hopefully you'll continue to be a part of our community and share in that, and any partnerships that we might be able to continue to develop. And I also just want to thank our participants today for their powerful questions, and any last comments you might have for us, Mike, as we close out today.
Well, just to say, one, thank you for the invitation to be a part of this community, and for me, it's actually very inspiring, as much of, you know, my own work and doing that quite a bit, and now to also be a part of an active community of scholar practitioners and hearing the work. So now that I've kind of come out of the bubble of post-PhD and needing that space and reinvigorated it, I'm very pleased and look forward to what's to come of this fielding, and I appreciate the openness to those that are outside like myself.
Great, excellent. So I also just want to let everyone know on the call, if you're interested in learning more or staying in touch with our coaching community of practice, you can reach out and join. If you go to coach.fielding.edu, you can find out more about our community of practice and watch previous videos that we have created together. So definitely reach out, and Mike has generously offered his dissertation. So I have a copy of it, and he's given us permission to share that with any other scholar practitioners in our coaching community of practice. So stay tuned, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.